trabajo.
we call The Future of Work,
Está
and it is a series that
comprometido
is committed to
temas que pertenece a la pandemia y los
topics that have
varios
to do with the pandemics and the several
de enfrentar
aspects of facing pandemics with technology and how
lo que es el tema del trabajo
it's evolving
en el nuevo mundo en que
with regards to work in this new world that we are in.
Atención
al tema we will focus on
de la pandemia y
the impact of pandemics and
evoluciones de tecnología en
the evolutions of technology in the judiciary processes. I'm very happy to have two panelists to present how things are evolving, how the justice system is evolving in Mexico with regards to facing the pandemics and these aspects that have to do with the judiciary. So the two panelists represent Mexico Evalúa, which is an investigative center in Ciudad de Mexico. First is Laurence Pantin, who is the coordinator of the Transparency Project of Mexico Evalúa. And she's got a doctorate of Flaxo in Mexico and a master's in journalism from NYU. Then we will hear Luis Rubio, who is the president of Mexico Evalúa and former president of the Mexican Council of International Relations in Mexico. He's also an editor, collaborator of the Reforma newspaper, and his analysis and opinions often show up in the main publications of Mexico, the US, and Europe. So I will give the mic first to Laurence, and she will introduce some topics for 15-20 minutes, and then we will go to comments from Luis Rubio. So welcome, Laurence. Go ahead. Thank you, John. First of all, I would like to thank CIPE not only for inviting us to this webinar, but also for organizing and setting up this series of virtual events with an issue of great relevance and something that I find fascinating. Thank you also to everyone who is with us today. For me, it is an honor to share this with John and Luis Rubio on how the new technology affects work of the attorneys. And it's a commonplace that to say that historically, political change, economical change, and social and technological change have transformed the professions. Some have been fading out, and others have come up. For the attorneys, it's not been different. The profession has been transforming as a result of these changes, but it also has been fragmenting more and more. Be it for the activities that are carried out or the different specializations that have come up. And today, we wouldn't be able to speak of just one profession, but several professions. For example, how to compare the work carried out by one public defendant and the work of the corporate lawyers or the notary publics. They all have their area, but they all belong to the legal profession. For this presentation, as a matter of fact, we will divide these attorneys into two groups. Those that operate the judiciary system, and clerks, those that anybody that works in the public office or a public defendant, public ministries, prosecutors, and then those that are in the private sector, mediators, corporate lawyers, private lawyers, attorneys. So that's how we will organize our presentation. But first, let's analyze how the new technologies can transform the ways of work of the attorneys, and then we will reflect on the impact that these technologies can have on labor in this profession. Finally, if I have time, I will finish with some recommendations. First, I want to talk about how the new technologies have changed the way we work, the way of work of those that do work as lawyers or attorneys. Now there are many tools that have been created to make work more efficient. Some judiciary courts, as a matter of fact, more often than not in the last year, because of the pandemic, we have had applications and web pages that allow lawyers to present documents online and to check their files, their case files, remotely. We have also authorized the use of platforms for video conferences for hearings. These tools change the way of work of the attorneys, obviously. You no longer have to send junior lawyers to take photocopies of a case file, as was the way we do it before, but these tasks can be done from the office. This means that there's a lot of savings in times and resources. But in order to use these tools, we also need to be updated in IT knowledge. This is specific for some generations of lawyers. I don't know if you remember the famous attorney that everybody saw on the social media, fighting with technology to be able to connect to a hearing or struggling. The way we relate with work is also different. Before, a lawyer could learn a lot about the patterns of a judge or a decision that was relevant because he was just walking around court. Literally, now attorneys have to find other sources of information and socializing, and this sometimes is a little bit more, it requires more effort. There's also other apps that allow us to do searches and long texts or in folders that could be thousands of pages long. In some countries, there are algorithms of artificial intelligence that are being used by certain offices to analyze cases and detect patterns, or also to draft motions automatically. This changes the way we study the cases, but it's also a fact that this is possible only in the larger firms. In the long term, this could reduce the cost of legal fees that are quite simple, but it could be a disadvantage to the people who work in smaller firms. For the operators, for the people who work in the system, the tools developed by the judiciary or by the courts, as we have mentioned before, e-files or video conference hearings, have not only changed, as I said, the way that the lawyers work, but obviously the way the staff in the judiciary works as well. For example, these tools allow people to work in times of crisis, as the ones we are living in, which is an advantage for the institution. But for the people, it can also be an advantage because it allows flexibility, and it can also favor more participation from women in top and better positions. Many times women don't ask for these higher positions because of the workload and the time that they would have to, with a family life, it would be so hard to combine. So one could think that these tools could help them, but what this has actually shown is that teleworking isn't always positive, because there's a lot of stress when a person also has to be at home with the kids. It makes days longer, work days longer, and it's very hard to separate private life from work life or from the office. So one problem is that this is not still very well regulated, teleworking, and this has, as a matter of fact, this has generated some discussions, especially in Europe and some judiciaries, because well, on the other hand, many judiciaries have also implemented tools for admin management that seek to make more efficient the follow-up of work from the staff. Some examples are apps with like GPS for people who send notifications, and these apps follow the pathways of the clerks to make the best of their time and to make sure that they were in the right place to deliver their letter. One example in Mexico is Actuarius in the judiciary of Querétaro. There's also systems, automated systems of the files that allow us to trace what is being done and the real time and see how long everybody is taking to do his work, the number of cases he has, and also there can be an alert about in order to not have delays. These tools on behalf of the institution allow us to evaluate the work of the officers more easily and to detect bottlenecks and see if they need more support. Maybe the burden is too heavy. And it can also help to see the training needs that some staff may have. But these systems also require more control on the staff, and sometimes it's something that they resent, something that they consider negative. They don't like, they feel that they are being pried, that somebody's prying into their life. And in order to carry out or to use this type of apps, we have to rethink the whole process and to rethink the way it has been done for ages. Some tools have artificial intelligence to support the people in their decisions. One example of these apps is Compass, which has been used in the US in some courts. And these algorithms, especially, allow us to calculate the risk of flee or contempt of the people. This could seem very attractive, first because the judges don't have the capacity of calculating the probability of contempt or fleeing. So that's efficient. And also, we have seen that the judges could have certain prejudice or their decisions could be biased due to external factors. There have been some studies carried out that show that the judges make decisions or more severe decisions when it's close to lunchtime. And the hypothesis is that their glucose level drops, the glucose level in their blood, and this could affect their decision making because it could affect their temper, or because there's a lot of cases that they're accumulating, and since many times there's heavy emotional burdens, this could affect their decision making. Also, these tools of artificial intelligence have been criticized for many other aspects. One of the main problems is that these algorithms are programmed precisely with databases of old cases which could or should or have certain problems, so that the results perpetuate these problems. There have been many studies carried out with regards to Compass on this matter. On the other hand, the algorithms cannot justify their decision as a judge must do. They just give a result. And one of the problems that was detected is that these algorithms are not transparent. So this impedes us to see how the result is obtained. The problem with these tools is that they can reduce the capacity of the decision-making of the judge. In some counties of the US, the law says that the judge must use the recommendation of the algorithm, but if he doesn't want to, he has to justify why. This is more work for court, which causes people to want to obey the algorithm. So this poses a problem, and along this in Estonia, there has been a project announced of where they are working to develop a robot judge to solve certain cases, small cases. This raises a lot of expectations, but some criticism, because with a tool like this, in a certain way, we would annul the rendering of accounts. An algorithm or machine cannot be accountable later for any decisions, for any So some of these, because of this criticism, the government of Estonia already explained that appeals of the cases that would be solved by humans. So the appeals of the robot cases would be solved. So that's the way they have found to deactivate some criticism. Now, on the side of the public defendants, we've also created some interesting tools. There's an interesting example in Chile that is a virtual assistant that is used now only in hearings. This algorithm has given the possibility of somebody to be, or gives the defendant an argument, good arguments for the case. What some of the advantages are that it allows the institution evaluate the work of the defendants, because it analyzes the reasons why a defendant obtained a result against the prediction. But it also allows the defendant to know how to better argue and give priority to the different cases, but it also works the way they work. The interesting thing is that after a few weeks of adaptation and resistance on behalf of some defendants, one day, say the system fails, and that day the defendants realized that the application was helping them or was being useful, but suddenly it became difficult for them to work without the app. They depended on it too much. So those are some of the tools that, as I mentioned, have changed the way the staff works. And finally, I did want to mention tools that help to make some tasks more efficient. For example, there are algorithms that can make complaints more agile with very little intervention from a human being. These tools can also help analyze large amounts of complaints, and we can group them so that when similar elements are presented, well, then there can be a predetermined response. This has two main advantages. It allows the staff to give priorities to cases and to stop doing repetitive work, but it also allows them to spend time on more significant tasks. I just want to give you an example. This tool, Prometea, is a tool that was developed by the Innovations and Artificial Intelligence Lab of the Law School of the University of Buenos Aires, and it has had amazing results. This tool was trained to find cases, priority cases of health in Colombia, of 2,700 cases. Prometea was able to find, I think, 22 cases in 2 minutes. This would take 96 days of work, and this was just done in a few minutes. They chose which cases to give priority to. This tool was also trained to analyze the public procurement system of Buenos Aires and to draft the bid specifications. People needed 247 clicks, opening 39 windows, and copying and pasting over 20 bits of information. With Prometea, this was substituted by 14 questions that once they are answered, they deliver a document that is already fully drafted. And while doing it traditionally took 2 hours, with Prometea, it takes 1 minute. Now, the huge number of technological progress and technological tools that have permeated the legal profession, there has been some fear because these technologies could completely substitute the work of lawyers. At first, actually, data, not all data shows this trend. Historically, the number of lawyers has grown per year. As a matter of fact, Galante mentions that the economic growth many times is parallel to the growth of the amount of lawyers. So the relation between the automatization of processes and the lack of employment is not automatic because the needs are transformed, and therefore the type of attorneys that are needed is also transformed. If we look on the side from those that work as lawyers, there's an idea that certain tools that allow the users find legal information and advice to solve simple matters without having to go to an attorney could actually, well, make the profession disappear. Many times, though, when you look at the cases that are solved thanks to these apps, you see that because of the amount, they shouldn't really need a lawyer because these tools allow access to justice to people who probably wouldn't have the resources to hire an attorney. On the other hand, there's also some tools conflicts online that make negotiation easier without needing to hire a lawyer. But again, this means that we will no longer have lawyers? Well, actually, if this were generalized, maybe we could reduce the need of certain types of lawyers, litigants, but at the same time, we would need more mediators. And in order to be a mediator, yes, you don't have to be an attorney, but there's many attorneys that have become mediators and they're quite successful. About the impact in the staff, the people of Prometea see the impact immediately. When they take part of an institution, in order to detect possibilities of automatization, they do not analyze the employment that could be automated, but the tasks that every type of employer does and could be automated. This means, in reality, they don't look to make employment disappear, but the time made by public servants when part of the tasks is automated, normally manually, could be reinvested in the institution in two ways. First of all, many times we know that the institutions have problems of delay. So this time could be used to reduce all this backlog. On the other hand, liberating staff from repetitive work can give them the possibility of doing other things, such as make them feel that they are heard, that they are being dealt with more humanely. This means that in a certain way, if artificial intelligence is well implemented, it has the potential of humanizing justice. I think I will end here because it's well over 20 minutes, but I hope that we can continue speaking in the comments section.
Gracias, Laurence. Muy interesante. Antes de pasar la palabra al doctor Rubio, voy a invitar.
Thank you, Laurence. Very interesting. Before Mr. Rubio speaks, if there are any questions, please use the chat box. It can be in English or Spanish.
Questions in English, feel free to do so, and we will get them to the panelists. Bueno, pues voy a invitar a comentarios del doctor Rubio. Luis Rubio, tiene la palabra.
Mr. Rubio will now make some comments.
Está en mute.
Gracias, John. La intersección.
Thank you, John. The interaction between the daily activities and technology is always complex. Throughout history, technology has modified the way we do things. And the natural thing through time is that technology is absorbed little by little as we learn new things. We learn content. We make it part of the process everywhere in life. What we have seen in the last year is something totally new, totally different. In the last decade, technology has sort of invaded our way of life. Thinking about the importance of a cell phone has nowadays, that is an extension of our hand, is something that didn't exist just 10 years ago. But pandemics has changed everything, and in that sense, nobody can say that we are in discontinuity times. What Laurence has mentioned is a perfect example of technology in the judiciary. I would like to start by the most generic or abstract thing, and then we will land on what she has mentioned. If you watch the economy in general, what we are seeing is a phenomenon that we had never seen before, or that had practically not been before. Things are not moving, are not flowing. There are some sectors that are growing and others are becoming smaller. This doesn't only have to do with technology. In the financial markets, they always tell us that there are two ways in which the economy can respond. One is in a W or in an L. What they mean is with the W, the economy drops to then recover, like in the shape of a W. Or with the L, there's a sudden drop, and then people are stuck. So what we have seen today is more like a K, where some come up, some go down, some win, some lose. This is not new in itself. This happens, but I bring it to the table because what is behind is significant, and it has a direct impact on what Laurence has just mentioned. The economic sectors that advance have one or two characteristics, or they are indispensable services such as hospitals or food, distributors or producers, or they are activities and companies that have adapted to what many people call the industries of the future. The activities that involve new technologies have adapted almost naturally. They are in the digital world, but many traditional activities such as justice and lawyers and such, or like the ones that I mentioned, food and such, also continue functioning even though they are not known for state-of-the-art technology. The indispensable ones continue working, but the interesting thing is that whoever can adapt to the digital age will be able to perform much better and to develop, and the nations will develop even more. This goes hand in hand directly with the capacities of the state, because at the end of the day, the justice or the judiciary depends on that. Public policies have to start from the bottom up. In this case, elemental matters but are easy to forget, such as internet access, education, regulations that prevent transition to the digital world, or formal and informal practices that are of that burden or hurdle, to innovation. So how can we talk about this in societies that still have not solved things as simple as access to the internet? Nobody could imagine the last year without access to digital networks, but I'm sure that over half of the population of the world has no access to the internet. Pandemics did not change the world, but it did change the way we do things. And it divided society between those who live in the digital world and those who have no access. And in Mexico and in Latin America, the latter is the majority. Many of them barely have enough to eat, and many of them have to move about physically a lot. They have to go back and forth to work, so they have contracted the disease. When we talk about attorneys and the access to justice, there's a huge challenge. As an industry, Laurence's presentation mentioned, the work of attorneys is key for justice, but their role, and especially the way they carry it out, depends a lot on the focus that is adopted. And in these times, and the way technology is used, I think the way she presented it is very interesting because it opens doors to justice in populations that normally don't have access to this because they are physically far away or they have no access. Now, in order to make admin processes more efficient would be a significant advance in itself. Whoever visited a court in Mexico knows that it's more like a storage area for files, overly saturated, and it's not in any way a friendly place where issues are solved. And many of these issues are key to the people who go to court. So what Laurence is mentioning would make access to justice more expeditious. This in itself would be a huge achievement in a society that is so unequal and so unfair as ours, and it would mean a great progress. I really enjoyed what you mentioned about the algorithms. Also, from my side, without knowing so many of these things in full, some of those algorithms that are developed for the Anglo-Saxon law is maybe more applicable, ironically, to Roman law, the Roman law system, because it's more predictable, because it's fixed rules that do not change through time unless they go through a legislative process for change. But this, of course, doesn't apply to the comments she made about the judges and who depend on external variables such as lunchtime. This makes everything different, and it makes us not so sure about some technologies. So the challenges of artificial intelligence, like she mentioned, there's many challenges, and there's still a lot of work ahead in the long term, even though this technology is already being implemented every day. The point is, technology opens enormous doors for justice, and everything would improve if we could adapt other mechanisms such as mediation, and this type of mechanisms would allow efficient resolutions and more efficient ones. And finally, if justice does not move fast, there's no justice, because it doesn't solve the issue or the problem of people who don't make a lot of money or who don't have a lot of knowledge about how to access justice or how to go into this world that would be so difficult. This is also true for the financial sector, for a lot of people in the financial sector, the equivalent would be a bank. A bank would be intimidating for a lot of people. They would never dream of having a bank account. So this is a very valuable exercise. It's great to think about how we can improve justice through transforming the way the attorneys work within that space. Thank you so much for the opportunity of commenting on this, and I congratulate you, Laurence, and thank you to my friend John Semko for this initiative. He trying to
Muchas gracias, Luis.
Help support the development of Mexico and the region. Thank you. Now we will go to the Q&A. For the first question, I want to elaborate on what Luis has mentioned. What are the minimum requirements to participate in the system from the user side and the supplier to participate in this judiciary system? And also, how is Mexico doing, or how is Mexico willing to extend these services to the whole population?
Muy interesante pregunta. Bueno,
good question. I think it's important to mention that in Mexico, what we saw, or as a matter of fact, I want to promote a document that we published last year that is called Guideline of Best Practices in the Use of New Technologies for Imparting Justice that you can find on our webpage. What we saw is that precisely there is a huge discrepancy or a gap between the different judiciaries of Mexico. Mexico is a federal country that has a judiciary, federal system, and another and every entity, and there's 32 of them. So there, what we were able to see is that some judiciaries had some tools that they had developed from some years ago, and others in the last year had to go into this in full, and it has caused them some issues, some problems. Obviously, so okay, what is required? As Luis mentioned, and I didn't actually get to that recommendations part because I was short on time, but one of the things that Luis mentioned was the need of a regulation that would allow the use of new technologies in the judiciary. So in the criminal arena, they already have this, but it's still pending approval in the other. So this has been an impediment for some judiciary. So it is an important topic. Now, in terms of requirements, obviously the budget is always something that can allow or impede if you have the resources.
Pero lo que vimos también es que
what we saw also is that not all the tools
that in
this pandemic have allowed the judiciaries to continue working are expensive. There are some ideas that were very creative from some judiciaries to allow the work to continue flowing and to not stop at all or in full. For example, enabling some phone lines for setting dates for
ciertos trámites. Esto ha
permitido paperwork, or this has allowed us to, in a very adverse context like we had, and this is not so difficult, or the possibility of presenting lawsuits against some, through emails, or obviously the identification of people is difficult, and the identification of attorneys to make sure that the person who's sending the email is actually the person who, or the person truly is that person. But there are some verification processes to check the authenticity. What I want to say is that in terms of the requirements, obviously, they depend on budget and regulations, but also on political will. The judiciaries that had already started this had a vision that it was a need, and now we are confirming this. It was necessary for the users. I think it's also important to say that clearly in Mexico, there's no internet access everywhere, and this is a problem. But what some judiciaries have done is to set up in some buildings, in some of their buildings, or even in prosecutors' offices or others, there's agreements with other institutions of the government to make internet available with internet connection. And this is easy because if they themselves don't have access in their homes, so that they can go somewhere and have access. It's not the ideal thing, of course, because if you think of the development of new technologies, it's to avoid that people can take risks, but I think that there have been solutions that have allowed us to not close access to justice in full because there are new technologies. I don't know if this is clear.
Muy bien, gracias. Tenemos varias preguntas interesantes. Ojalá.
Thank you. There's many interesting questions. I hope we have time to cover all of them. I will read this question from a participant. It says, With regards to artificial intelligence, how read it? How good can it be to evaluate and make decisions when there's so many factors to take into account? For example, in accusatory systems, the credibility of a witness can be key, and this credibility can only be evaluated through looking at them straight in the eye to measure their credibility. How can artificial intelligence carry out and complement analysis that always will depend on the human bias and human criteria? This is an excellent question. It's a huge debate. What we say in our guideline is that not all of the processes can be carried out remotely, precisely because there are some things, not just credibility of the witnesses, but also the physical tests are just that could be very complicated when you have to look at the weapon of the crime, let's say, or if you're only looking at it through a picture and you cannot see the weapon in itself, this could be a hurdle. As a matter of fact, a good practice that we found in Chile in this regard is that they started to develop what they call a feasibility hearing. This is not part of the law, but it is a hearing that they started to carry out with all of the people involved in court to see how likely it was to do this hearing remotely.
La fiscalía, por ejemplo,
bearing in mind, taking into account what the prosecutor's office said and the defense, so they would all agree on if it was a process that could be carried out remotely and not physically. So these evaluations are very important. It is very important for certain trials to be carried out online, especially now more than ever, because if not, it would be like stopping justice. But there are some processes that are not desirably or should not be done this way. And this is what the regulation has to allow certain flexibility. As a matter of fact, it's interesting to see now in Chile that this hearing that was created when all of this began is already fading out because the parts and the attorneys are more used now. They are less afraid of beginning a trial remotely. So it's interesting that they have become this familiar with remote hearings, and this has all happened very quickly. Thank you, Luis. Do you want to add something to the question? No, just to say that I agree, and that the problem of saying someone is guilty in a criminal case, or even signing an agreement without being able to see the body language of the other person is very difficult. I think those are the huge challenges that this type of technology has. We have to understand that we are solving a problem that we will be able to use many mechanisms in the future, but there are things that we cannot, that human contact can just not be replaced. Thank you. The next question is, in Mexico, lawyers have resisted new technologies. What can we do to change this point of view? Yeah, another very interesting question. I think that, first of all, it has to do with training and sharing, and some judiciaries in Mexico have done it in the last month, and I think it was very useful. They have had online courses or workshops, like we are all, we're being so active online, but this training is very useful for attorneys to teach them how to use the new technologies. This is key, but also there's something that I think that the current situation is forcing, or even the internal operators that many times have had many resistance. The current situation has forced them to adapt. And there is no better argument that, well, your case will not be ready if it's not done digitally. And for an attorney, well, the possibility of collecting also depends on them being able to use this technology. It's interesting to see that in some judiciaries, in some states where the judiciary didn't have IT tools, some attorneys have been very demanding. And so I think, because they did want technology, the private parties, when we presented this guideline, we received a phone call
Colegio de Abogados
from the bar of Mexico. They said, can we present this to our people? So I think that these resistances exist, but also I'm hopeful because there are many attorneys who are interested and do want to do it or do want to use it. I think, yes, there is a lot of resistance. I mean, the transition process of the judiciary took over 15 years and it's still not finished. There's not a single school of law that has adapted to the new system, and it's already been 15 years. So obviously there is resistance, there's a lot of resistance, and it's just part of the nature of the culture, in the case of Mexico at least, but pandemics has shown that the resistances can be broken because there's no other way.
En México, como en muchos países en Latinoamérica,
Mexico, like in many countries in Latin America, corruption limits the access to justice. How can digital means limit corruption in the judiciary? I love those questions. They're all very good. This is a question that I love. This is a key issue. As a matter of fact, this precisely is something that technologies can have a huge advantage because there's different levels of corruption. But one level that there is a lot in Mexico is the low level of corruption. That I get to court and I need to check my file, so I have to tip someone in the office to find a file for me so that I can take copies so that I can look at it. So the possibility of having an e-file or a file online that helps so that I don't have to have contact with somebody, with a public servant, to check my file, this reduces a lot of this type of corruption at this level. And this type of corruption is what makes the judiciaries look so bad. There's also corruption at higher levels, of course. I will buy the judge, or I will give the judge something to get something else in return. But I think that this is not the majority of the cases. There are some issues, but actually what makes the judiciaries look so bad in Mexico is the low-level corruption, the day-to-day corruption. That is the tip, the bribe, etc. So I think that the new technologies can help a lot in this regard. Now, another thing that is very important to know is that not because we are becoming technological, we will eradicate all problems such as corruption or backlog. Actually, if people want to buy a judge or bribe a judge, they will always find a way anyway. It depends on the judges to resist or not, to resist to temptation, obviously.
Muy bien. Luis, ¿otro comentario?
Very good. Luis, another comment? Or I agree with Laurence.
Otra pregunta de un participante que voy a leer. En la medida en que estos algoritmos...
Another question says, while these algorithms tie the hands of the judges, I think there's a serious question of due process. So if unknown people program unknown factors of unknown importance to guide or impose decisions, how do we guarantee that these algorithms will be at least fair and transparent? Well, yeah, that's the, yeah, I think that in the question, you have your answer. There is no way. I mean, that's my point of view, at least. Obviously, it's, not everybody shares this with me, but I think that these algorithms can be useful, but if besides having the algorithm there's this almost obligation of the judge to use it. So And when something is imposed on the judge, if he wants to not use the algorithm, well, it also will not be. I think that these tools can exist, but we have to acknowledge that if they are not transparent, if they are built with databases that are already biased, well, then we have to be very careful with the use of these tools. The important thing to acknowledge here is that technology gives us access to, number one, the information that many times is so complicated to just have access to it that nobody can see it. When we're in the digital world, everybody has access to the same information and they can compare things. That makes things balance out and the capacities and the possibilities of a more expeditious justice with less corruption. That in itself is already an important base. The other thing is human decisions that could be assisted by technologies, but at the end of the day, have to be a decision of the judge, because that's his job. As a doctor decides how they will proceed in surgery, the same thing happens with a judge. That is their responsibility, and no algorithm can substitute. They can help a better decision-making process, but that's it. Thank you. One component of this type of justice that we haven't talked about yet is the private sector. More and more companies are offering products and services that are digital and they require a specific legal framework. How much has justice in Mexico advanced in this for companies? Sorry, I didn't understand your question too well. Through technologies, you mean? Or I don't know if I got your question, sorry. Well, first of all, is if it's a role in this type of justice to decide in processes that belong to the private sector. But I think that the second part is if the services that are provided by the digital companies or if they require a specific legal framework. I think there's two components to this question. Okay, I don't know if I will answer your question specifically, but something that comes up or comes to my mind is that in Mexico, one of the subjects where we encourage the digital part or from, okay, there's the commercial part because it is more interesting for the private companies. This part was more developed. So there was an idea that digital justice allows processes to be more efficient. And they had to try to make the service more efficient, specifically for the companies or the corporations. So this was a decision that was made, and I think is okay in a certain way, because precisely one of the things that companies complain about the most in Mexico is how much time it takes for a process, and the uncertainty and the lack of rule of law, the uncertainty on the rule of law. So this is an important element to take into account. Then about how many regulations of the services, the digital services that are offered. If I understood the second part well, I think that this is something that is still under construction, as in many parts of the world.
Hay algo ya realizado, pero digamos
there is something
otro pendiente creo que se tiene.
Another thing that we still
Como lo estoy diciendo,
have that we're still lagging in is regulations. Even the use of new technologies by the judiciary is not fully regulated.
Hay muchos sectores
so there's many sectors
la regulación
where there's still
Yo creo que esto
this has still not been regulated, so this is still being constructed. Luis, what do you think about this? Yeah, from the other side, what I see is that the law firms are digitalizing everything, so they have faster access to all the information. Now everything is online, so it makes things easier. The law firms that work with private companies have become more efficient. So there is this problem that Laurence already mentioned, that once they have a case, be it commercial, civil, or criminal, then they come across all the problems that we already mentioned before. But at that level, I think that there's no need for a change in regulation.
Y lo que veo es un enorme avance en ese lado.
Pero we do see a huge progress, but also a bottleneck when we get to the regulatory process.
Un par de minutos.
Thank you. We have a couple of minutes to wrap up, and I think that I have a perfect question just to end our hour. What regulations limit the access to digital justice in Mexico? And is there real political will at a federal level to facilitate the access to judicial, to justice?
Como lo decía, en materia mercantil y civil ya hay esta posibilidad.
As I said before,
digital está previsto en la normatividad.
This is foreseen in the norms. This civil and family law.
En México, donde no hay.
We have the most cases in Mexico where this possibility is not foreseen in the law. This depends on the approval of a national code of civil and family code. Actually, Congress in Mexico, because of a reform in 2017, had the obligation to produce. It has not approved all of it in full. The good news is that there is an initiative presented by Pilar Ortega. It is the president of the committee in the House of this code. Also, there's an initiative
que viene del Poder Judicial de la Ciudad de México.
That comes from the judiciary of Ciudad de Mexico. So the good thing is that there's two texts, and we know there's political will for this, but the texts, I mean, they not only have to do with digital justice, but they have to include these three aspects. And from what we have seen, they still need a little bit so that they can cover all the situations that already exist in Mexico. So let's say that it is important and there is political will by some players. We have to manage for the members of the House and or Senate, both Congress, and because it is a code that is very wide and has many other things, such as the possibility of taking family matters and civil matters to oral trial as well, we're still not there. But on the other hand, I think that something that should be done, and I haven't found it yet in Mexico, is a nudge on behalf of the federal government. From the same way that many resources have been required to implement the criminal reform, I think that to implement digital justice requires the support of the federal government. We haven't seen it yet, but besides this national code that I mentioned, there's also some initiatives of constitutional reform to include
servicios de justicia
the
digital.
obligation of providing digital services. And this initiative,
hay un texto que ya se aprobó en
okay, there's some text that was already approved in Congress, and this text, it says basically, okay, we need to promote digital justice. And the interesting thing is that the transitory ones have the obligation for the legislative and executive to foresee funds or resources. So we'll say that they're in a certain way, okay, we know that there is an interest of certain actors or certain people in the government, we still need the last bit.
Muy bien, gracias. Luis, ¿tiene algún comentario
Luis,
para
any
finalizar?
final comment?
Yo solo diría que la manera de avanzar en México en
I think that the
general,
way to move
pasos
forward in Mexico in
para
general
atrás.
is
Porque
two
lo que
steps
pasa es
forward,
que
one step backwards.
iniciativas
Because
muy ambiciosas,
initiatives
pero no se
that are
cuidan los
very
detalles,
ambitious are
y
approved,
entonces
but we
después hay que
don't look into
corregir
the
todo eso.
fine lines, and then
tema de
everything
la
has to be
justicia
corrected and amended.
es el mejor ejemplo. Se
So
aprobó una gran
oral
cosa y
court
toda
is,
clase de
yes, it's a great example because it was approved,
tenemos
but then it was hard to implement.
un
So
reconocimiento de que esto hay que avanzarlo.
we know that we have to move forward,
Avanzando, y lo que vamos
we
a ver es
know,
muchas cosas que
and we
avanzan
will
muy
see
rápido,
many things that move
tenemos
fast,
para poder hacerlo
but then
bien.
there's no resources so that it can be done well.
Cosas
Or
regulatorias
that
o legislativas que no se hicieron a tiempo.
some
Pero
things
sí
were
hay
not done on time,
de que esto tiene que hacerse.
that there is
No
an
viene de la
acknowledgement
conciencia,
that this must be done.
pero en este caso probablemente es
In this
mejor que
case,
todo sea,
probably
que no sea
it's better than not because then it's not so political.
Bueno, muchas gracias a
Okay, thank you very much
los dos panelistas por una
to the two panelists for such a wonderful event, so such an interesting discussion
respuestas que nos provoca
with
pensar
clear
en el
answers
futuro de la
and food for
justicia.
thought for the future of justice in the world in this digital era.
Este evento está grabado.
This event is being recorded and it will
CIPE.
be placed on our CIPE webpage.
Quieren participar.
So if you want, or first I want to thank the participants also for their great questions. And if you want to follow us
eventos en el futuro
for future events, this initiative of this series of the future of work, you can follow us on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn. It's there on the chat box. There's the link so that you can follow us. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Luis Rubio. Thank you to Laurence. And I wish you all a good rest of the day. Thank you. Thank you very much.